Welcome back once again to A Push by Strunk. I got so many comments from my students on the shout out that I gave to Franklin Mejia that they wanted me to give them a shout out this year too. So shout out to my 4th period and 7th period classes. You kids are definitely my students. All right. Hopefully, whoever you are, wherever you are, you've already started this thing called the Progressive Era. And you've gotten a little bit of background on who the Progressives were, and what they wanted to do, where they came from. Today we're going to be looking specifically at the first of the Progressive presidents, the man named Theodore Roosevelt. And so we'll go and look at what all he does as a Progressive president. Now, so you are aware, there are 3 progressive presidents. The first one, of course, this guy Theodore Roosevelt. He ascended to the presidency upon the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. And I'll give you a little bit more background on that here in just a second. Roosevelt serves 2 terms. I won't be talking about his re-election. He's succeeded by William Howard Taft, who serves 1 term from 1909 to 1913, and then finally our last progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, 1913 and 1921. I won't be going over Taft or Wilson in this presentation. This is just about Theodore Roosevelt to try to keep it short and sweet. If you want more information on either of those guys, you can ask your teacher or do some research. Google, textbooks, those are always great places to go if you're into studying history. But anyway, Theodore Roosevelt, let's talk a little bit about his background. This is going to go hopefully pretty quickly right here. Okay, Theodore Roosevelt made a name for himself as a political reformer kind of from the beginning of his career. In 1882, he became a member of the New York State Assembly, that's New York State Legislature, and began introducing bills that we would probably call progressive legislation. Even though the progressive era really hasn't gotten going yet, he's still a progressive in that he's trying to introduce things that are going to clean up the problems that he sees that exist in the Gilded Age. Now, in 1884, he's actually going to leave the legislature. He's going to take some time off. He has a personal tragedy in his life. Both his mother and his wife die on the exact same day. His wife died from complications due to childbirth with their only daughter, Alice. And so he takes some time off. You can see the grief that he has here in his diary entry for that day, that the 2 most important women in his life died. Thursday, February 14th, 1884. He takes some time off. You can do your own research about what he does then. But in 1889, he comes back into government service as a member of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, trying to, again, clean up some of the political corruption as a civil servant there. He serves from there till 1895. In 1895, he returns to New York City and is elected New York City Police Commissioner and will try to do what he can to clean up the police department there. In 1897, he'll go back to the federal service. He's involved in the Spanish-American War. Some of you may have already gone over imperialism in the Spanish-American War. Some of you may be doing that after this unit on the progressives. But just a quick review or preview, he, in 1897, became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and really was a proponent of the Navy and pushing military preparedness. And in 1898, he would help begin our military involvement in the Spanish-American War. He'll then resign and go join the Army and was a member of the Rough Riders, who fought in Cuba. He takes the popularity that he gained from the Spanish-American War in 1898 and gets himself elected governor of New York. So 1898 was a significant year in his life. And then as governor of New York, once again, he begins introducing political reforms to correct what he thought were the abuses that he saw in politics, economics, and society during the Gilded Age. From here, he will be nominated to be the vice president. And this This is all about the progressive era. As a progressive governor, he's trying to clean things up. The corrupt political and business interests in New York weren't a fan of that, of course. Those who were Republicans in the year 1900, there is a presidential election, and they convince the Republican National Committee to replace William McKinley's current vice president with Theodore Roosevelt. Their thinking being, if they can get him out of New York and put him in a position that has little to no power, then they will have taken care of this person who's going to clean up corruption. Someone who was late to the meeting and didn't get to voice his opinion over this before the decision was made, when he found out, his exact words were, "Don't you realize you just put that man a heartbeat away from the presidency?" But short-sightedness being what it is, no one thought that in 1901 William McKinley would be assassinated. Certainly not Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt thought that his political career was over because from the 1800s, what's one vice president that you can name off the top of your head that didn't become president? But with McKinley's assassination, Roosevelt ascends to the presidency, and now he'll be able to use that platform to spread his ideas of the progressive movement and progressive reforms. So, how is Roosevelt kind of an exemplar of the progressive movement? I like teaching Roosevelt as kind of an example of, look, what were the progressives interested in? If there's any progressive that's interested in everything, Roosevelt's going to come closest. He supports labor. That's not necessarily a popular political thing in the Gilded Age, but for the progressives, support for labor was a big deal. In 1902, there's something called the anthracite coal miners' strike. It's a specific type of coal, and thousands of these coal miners go on strike, led by John Mitchell and their big union, the United Mine Workers. Okay, so many different workers from many different businesses go on strike. Their demands were pretty simple. They wanted a 20% wage increase, they wanted the 8-hour day, and probably most importantly, they wanted the businesses to recognize and therefore begin to negotiate with the union in contract disputes. Now, the businesses refused to negotiate with the union. Okay, businesses felt that as time went on and the available supply of coal dwindled, the price of coal would rise. This would put financial burden on the American public, and therefore the businesses felt the public would turn against the union. And more than that, they felt that the government would then step in to shut the strike down and force the workers to return to work. They said they had history on their side. The government always was on the side of business. Roosevelt did indeed step in, but Roosevelt instead threatened to take over the mines. He reminded the businesses that as president he can issue an emergency declaration, and he threatened to take over the mines and have the government operate them. Now, Roosevelt was not a socialist. That would be a more socialist idea, but Roosevelt felt the businesses were acting in bad faith. And so when he made that threat, lo and behold, the businesses then changed their minds and chose instead to negotiate with the union, giving the union a lot of what they wanted thanks to that pressure from the government that helped them. Now, if you didn't already figure that out from that, Roosevelt is also against some of the big businesses, and he's going to fight back against those big monopolies that had been created during the Gilded Age. In the early 1900s, there's a company that forms called the Northern Securities Company. The short version is it is a railroad monopoly, and progressives were worried about this because monopolies tend to be bad for the consumers. And they felt that this one railroad company operating in the west of the United States was going to be bad for consumers. Roosevelt felt that it was also going to be bad, and so he ordered the U.S. Justice Department to sue the Northern Securities Company, take them to the court to try to break them up. The company, much like the coal mining companies, wasn't that worried about it. The courts generally always sided with the companies. But Roosevelt felt that they were a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. So when they get to court, the government lawyers were able to prove in the Supreme Court that Northern Securities was indeed in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, and they did break the company back up into the original 3 or so railroads that it had originally been. This is a huge change. Now, it wasn't an overwhelming verdict. It was 5-4. But still, it's a huge signal to the businesses that they all of a sudden have to start dealing with this progressive era. And this cartoon right here shows Roosevelt as governor. And all the big businesses laughing at him and his ideas of reform. This one over here, now that he's president of the Northern Securities, has happened. All these people coming to him, begging him on bended knee, please don't break us up. Roosevelt is going to break up. He's going to order the Justice Department to go after and break up over 44 monopolies in his 2 terms as president. This will earn him the nickname of Trust Buster. And I'm going to emphasize a couple of these details, like Roosevelt breaking up 44 monopolies in 2 terms, for when you look up stuff on later progressive presidents and what they do, so that you can start trying to evaluate, okay, who really deserves that nickname, Trust Buster? Roosevelt is also going to push Congress to pass increased regulatory legislation. The Elkins Act strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission as being on the U.S. Civil Service Commission. Roosevelt had seen the limitations of some of these government agencies, and so he wanted some of them to be strengthened. Let's give the ICC the power to actually fine companies and actually do something. In 1906, Congress will pass this thing called the Hepburn Act, which extended Interstate Commerce Commission regulation over pretty much all interstate transportation. Not everything. There's going to be new inventions over time that Congress will have to deal with and add to. But for 1906, most interstate transportation fell then under the ICC. Now, Roosevelt is also an efficiency progressive. This may not be something you're familiar with, an efficiency progressive. Efficiency progressives wanted things done the most efficient way possible. And so in this case, Roosevelt and these efficiency progressives don't view every single monopoly as being a bad monopoly. From the cartoon here, Roosevelt the hunter, okay, hunting down the bad trusts and restraining or regulating what they felt were the good trusts. And Roosevelt felt there were a couple of things that might be good trusts. One of them would be something called a natural monopoly. A natural monopoly is a company that is able to take over the market because it does everything better. Like there's no breaking of the rules, there's no unfair business practices. It's just they do it better than everybody else. Why was Amazon able to put Sears out of business? Because Amazon does it better than Sears. They may be treating their workers horribly, but that's for a different video. Another set of monopolies that Roosevelt felt were okay were government-regulated monopolies. These are monopolies that are basically granted by the government with the idea that having one company do it is just the most efficient way of doing things. Here in the state of Texas, there is one company that is in charge of all of the electrical lines. We have many companies that produce electricity in their electric plants. We have many companies that will sell electricity to households and businesses, but we only have one company that puts up and maintains the actual electric lines. It's easier and more efficient. There's fewer lines running, and if there's a storm and a line goes down, who's going to put the line back up? Just the one company. We don't have to worry about, okay, whose is this? Who do we need to call? It's just the one company. But whether it's a natural monopoly or a regulated monopoly, Roosevelt felt both of them needed to be watched and regulated. After going after Northern Securities and starting to use the Justice Department to break up these monopolies, Roosevelt is going to be approached by J.P. Morgan and U.S. Steel. J.P. Morgan essentially says, look, we all know that I'm a monopoly. What do I need to do to keep my monopoly? Roosevelt felt U.S. Steel was one of those kind of good monopolies under this efficiency idea. One company producing good quality steel is better than a lot of companies competing and making maybe lower quality in the idea of I'm going to cut costs so I can make more sales. So Roosevelt and Morgan made a gentleman's agreement. Okay? The gentleman's agreement, they shook hands on it. Roosevelt promised the government would not sue U.S. Steel to break them up as long as U.S. Steel reformed their business practices, kind of turning their books open to the government, saying, here's why we're doing what we're doing, here's why everything is fine. Roosevelt and the progressives are also interested in protecting consumers. And so one of the biggest consumer protection issues in the progressive era is highlighted in this book called The Jungle, written by a muckraker named Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was attempting in this book, what he wanted to do is he wanted to show the benefits of socialism. He was a socialist, and he wanted to show the benefits of socialism and show how capitalism was bad. And so he wrote this book with the idea of this is going to teach Americans why capitalism is bad and socialism is good. Every single person who read the book missed the point. Because Upton Sinclair set his story in the meatpacking industry in Chicago, and he had gone to Chicago and he had seen the meatpacking industry, and so he wrote vivid details of the unsanitary conditions that existed in the nation's meatpacking industry, and that's what everybody focused on. As Upton Sinclair said at one point, I aimed for the nation's heart, and I hit its stomach. This book became a bestseller. Okay? People wanted to know what was in their meat. And, here, this great picture. When I first saw it, I thought, wow, those are some big knives. Oh my gosh, that's a wooden table they're setting everything on. That's not good for health and safety. Then there was this picture. Look at them making sausage. I'm not sure that's the best, safest, cleanest place either, with that steel drum open to everything. This one, that's a wooden cart we're hauling the meat parts away on. And finally, my favorite, giant hunks of beef dragging the floor. I don't even know what this over here is. And so the public is outraged over this book, and they demand something be done. The government is kind of outraged over this. Roosevelt is kind of outraged over this. So the government starts to investigate. They appoint a committee to go in and check things out. The committee comes back and says the book doesn't even come close to getting it right. It's actually worse. And so Congress is going to pass 2 laws as a result of The Jungle. The first one, which we might say is the most important, is the Meat Inspection Act. The government is going to go through and inspect the meat processing plants and make sure that they are cleaner than they were back then. This next law, the Pure Food and Drug Act, is sometimes called a companion law. The Pure Food and Drug Act simply says that if you're going to label food or drugs as a certain thing, it had better be that certain thing. In the early 1900s, one of the drugs that was, let's say, counterfeited was aspirin. Now, aspirin was a kind of a wonder drug in the late 1800s. Imagine a time when if you have a headache, you just have to deal with it, and then all of a sudden there's aspirin and it goes away. And people would make pills out of sugar, salt, other toxic chemicals, and they'd label it as aspirin. And so the Pure Food and Drug Act was designed to stop things like that. Roosevelt's also an environmental conservative. Okay? Now, Roosevelt may not be what we would think of nowadays as an environmentalist. He believed in managed use of the country's resources. He was an outdoorsman. He enjoyed the outdoors and the environment. But he's not going to say, don't cut down any trees. He's going to say, let's be careful how many we cut down. Let's replace the ones we cut down. But he did want us to use our natural resources. This is a picture of him and another environmental progressive named John Muir. John Muir would be more of the, okay, don't touch the environment. Okay. But Roosevelt is going to put the weight of the presidency behind some of this progressive legislation to protect the environment or promote certain aspects of the environment. In 1902, Congress passes this thing called the Newlands Reclamation Act, which establishes federal funding for different irrigation projects out in the West. They also passed in 1906 something called the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act allows the president to set aside land for national parks, national monuments, wildlife sanctuaries. The presidents are able to use this to kind of expand the protected lands within the United States. Roosevelt is also going to appoint a guy named Gifford Pinchot to head the U.S. Forest Service. As you study William Howard Taft, that's going to result eventually in a little bit of controversy for Taft, as Taft and Pinchot did not see eye to eye on things. So that ends our presentation on Roosevelt. There are limits to his progressive attitudes. He was the first president to invite an African American to dine in the White House. He dined with Booker T. Washington. Race riots in the South protesting that resulted in a number of lynchings, and some historians say that this caused Roosevelt to fail to push further civil rights actions. Whether it did or not, I don't know. But just like anybody else, Roosevelt isn't perfect. You're welcome to make your own study and your own judgments of him. Thanks for watching.